Awesome. Okay. So just a few housekeeping things. We're going to keep our videos and our microphones off. So during the Q&A, if you'd like to be unmuted, you can raise your hand or you can type your question in the chat and I'm happy to read it that way. If you have any technical difficulties, please let us know in the chat. And the recordings from all past digital health seminars can be found here at this QR code, and I will also post the link for that in the chat. And the recording from this seminar will be posted there shortly. Awesome. So I'm excited to introduce our speaker today. Taryn Ellens is a digital systems scientist and founder of iKnowMe Inc., a Yukon-based research and innovation company advancing data sovereignty, mental wellness analytics, and ethical AI for Indigenous and Northern communities. A PhD student in psychiatry and mental health at the University of Alberta, her work bridges clinical systems, Indigenous governance, and digital transformation, asking how technology can serve community-defined well-being rather than reinforce colonial binaries. Taryn brings experience across government, healthcare, and policy innovation with a focus on building ethical, human-centered systems for the North. And I will now pass things off to Taryn, who will start us off with the land acknowledgement. So, okay, you should be able to share your screen, Taryn. Thank you so much.
Okay. And are the slides up there?
Yeah, they look good to me. Let us know in the chat if anyone's having issues seeing them.
All right. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. I am thrilled to be talking about all of the exciting work that's happening up in the North. So just kind of before we dive into things, I wanted to begin by acknowledging that we are actually gathered on different traditional territories across Canada. Right now, I am on the traditional territory of Carcross-Tagish First Nation. I know on the slide it says Kwanlin First Nation and Tonquichan, which is typically where I do my work and where I live, but I'm out in the beautiful community of Carcross right now. The Yukon has provided me a beautiful, clean, and healthy space to raise my family. My husband and I and daughters, my one daughter was welcomed here, so it's going to forever be a part of our story, and I will honor it as such. It's really important that we don't just say these words when we're doing land acknowledgements, but that we feel them as our starting point. Today, I'm here to talk about technology, mental wellness, and artificial intelligence. But for many of us in the North, conversations about health and systems and data actually doesn't start with tools. They have to start with people, they have to start with place, because where we begin shapes where we end up. My journey here has been a bit of twists and turns. I started out in Alberta as a mental health clinician and moved to the Yukon with my family. When we moved up to the Yukon, I started working in mental wellness and substance use. And now, as Haley mentioned earlier, I'm a doctoral student at the University of Alberta in psychiatry and also building iKnowMe. I'm excited to be invited here today with you all as we're embarking on these exciting conversations that are happening all around artificial intelligence and data sovereignty. I often get told when I'm in conversations with people that my different lanes that I occupy, like mental health and Indigenous data sovereignty and tech, are siloed. And I've never been one to shy away from challenges. So today, I'm hoping to illustrate how all of these seemingly different concepts have always been connected and will always be connected. So with iKnowMe, I really focus on Indigenous data governance, AI, mental wellness, innovation. And in my studies, we're really looking at psychiatry, mental health, and the development over a lifespan, working in First Nations and Northern communities. So again, as diverse and complex as all of this is, somewhere along the way, one truth has always remained consistent and constant, and that is that relationships matter more than the tech that we create. So today, 100%, we're going to be talking about AI, but not as this shiny object or maybe even this foreign concept. We're going to talk about it as a tool that must be in service of communities and culture and wellness. So I'm going to share a little bit with you as to where I started to kind of unlearn my ways of thinking and start adopting a more relational, more reciprocal, more nuanced way of thinking about wellness and tech. Because I've had the privilege of walking alongside teachers who have openly shared their knowledge with me in hopes to make the world a better place. So okay, so the first topic we're going to talk about is really this problem of binary. So I'm kind of making the assumption that most of us are familiar with the concept of binary, or something having two parts. So two silos, two thoughts, two ways of being, this or that, yes or no. And really, all of our systems that we exist and operate in love binaries. The way our brains think, we really embrace binaries. It helps us to understand better. Binaries kind of create these clean boxes to put people in. So those of you in the audience who do assessments with clients or patients, we like to determine whether people are sick or well. Maybe they're traditional or Western. Maybe we're starting to look at human intelligence or machine intelligence. Because these binaries, like I mentioned, make systems easier to manage, easier to understand. However, while all of that is true, they also make people harder to understand. So in my line of work in mental wellness, we kind of see this all the time. So more recently, working in mental wellness and substance use, we did a lot of someone is addicted or they're recovered. They're in crisis or they're fine. They qualify for services or they don't qualify. But I think all of us know that that is just not how humans work. At one point, I was kind of working on an intensive inpatient treatment team in the Yukon, and I kept hearing the same questions over and over. And they were, how do I qualify to get that help? Or how do I qualify to get that service? So people were being told that they needed to attend outpatient programming first, and they needed to prove that they were committed to getting help, or they needed to meet multiple times with various intake workers, and worst of all, kind of complete this reflective homework that essentially required them to catalog how chaotic their life had become. But what I started to notice is that there is this very small sacred window when someone decides when they're actively using or they're in addiction or they're in crisis that they're ready. They have a moment of clarity, they have the courage, they reach out, they're willing, and that window is small and it doesn't stay open for very long. Yet the systems that we're operating in and that we've designed don't really honor that moment. They don't honor that tiny little bit of space. So the intake process that I was working within actually worked against this natural rhythm of readiness that I was kind of seeing across all different clients in the North from all communities and locally in Whitehorse. So by the time people were qualifying for help, this window was long gone. And this is kind of just one example of how binary systems fail to really reflect the nuance of lived reality, especially in substance use, which again, where I'm familiar with. The beautiful thing about my experience being up here was that I started to recognize Indigenous knowledge systems. They don't see wellness as a line with two endpoints. They recognize this little tiny beautiful window that I spoke about. They see wellness as relational, as cyclical, as contextual. Wellness isn't just this switch that we turn on when it's convenient. It's actually a really balanced, complex web of relationships. And the twist is that artificial intelligence has actually inherited this exact same binary problem. So most of the models that are commonly used or that people maybe here are familiar with, anything from therapy bots to transcript note takers, are trained on binaries or categorical assumptions. So is this good or bad, or is this safe or unsafe? And these systems really fail or struggle with nuance because we built them inside these same binary scaffolding that are the systems that we use. So before we talk about how AI can help, we first kind of have to unlearn the binary thinking that we've built in. So if I told you that Indigenous knowledge systems have actually been practicing what systems theory and artificial intelligence now call complex adaptive design for thousands of years, people would probably be looking at me with question marks on their face. So complex adaptive design is an approach to building AI systems that behave like machines. So they follow rigid instructions, more like living ecosystems that learn and evolve and adapt over time. So instead of treating a system like something is linear, so input A equals output B, complex adaptive designs recognize human behavior. So they recognize culture, or it recognizes wellness and health systems. And complex adaptive design recognizes that communities are dynamic and things are interconnected and they're constantly changing. So AI really needs to be built to change with them. And what is so beautiful and what I've started learning over the past couple of years is that Indigenous worldviews are built on feedback loops. They're built on interdependence, and they are constantly adapting. It's not about control or this linear cause and effect that we're so used to. Whereas Western models that a lot of us are familiar with often try to kind of control variables. So Indigenous systems read relationships. Instead of fixing the problems that we identify, it asks, okay, we've identified this problem, but what is shifting in the system around it? And how do we restore this balance? So what really, in essence, what they're doing is they're thinking of community wellness not as a score, but this living, evolving, changing data set. It's relational. When harm shows up, the response isn't necessarily to isolate the problem or isolate the individual. It's actually looking at strengthening the web around them. And so I hope I've illustrated that this is really where those two worlds meet. So the most advanced artificial intelligence systems are now moving away from the rigid rule-based logic towards more relational, more self-learning, more adaptive models. So in other words, AI systems are moving towards what Indigenous governance has always done. And really, Indigenous governance already functions like the most elegant algorithms that we have. They're learning, adapting, they're self-correcting through relationships. So rather than asking how we fit Indigenous knowledge into data systems, the real innovation is designing our systems, including AI, to behave more like Indigenous knowledge already does. So many of you, or maybe little of you, are familiar with OCAP. OCAP is ownership, control, access, and possession. So when many people hear the framework OCAP, you might start thinking along the lines of compliance or paperwork or restrictions. But let's reframe this here and now. OCAP is actually one of the most advanced data governance models on the planet. And it existed long before AI was even in the conversation. So some of you may be hearing just through different news of data breaches or people having access to data that it was never intended to be seen by. So governments and tech companies are really scrambling to figure out how are we protecting people's data when they sign up for services or when they sign up for products. In the European Union, they have the AI Act. In Canada, we have ADA legislation, which I'm going to talk about on the next slide. And big tech trust frameworks are all trying to solve this same core problem. So who has the right to data? Who's going to control it? What is it going to be used for? You know, who is benefiting from it? And how do we ensure that it's not being misused now? And how are we ensuring that it's not being misused later? And the wonderful thing is that OCAP actually answered these questions when it was created. They answer these questions, or it answered these questions with clarity and humanity, most or more than most modern policies. So we aren't going to go through all of OCAP today, but one point that I did want to highlight is the concept of ownership and possession, because this is really important and kind of frames this entire presentation. But while ownership identifies the relationship between people and their information in principle, possession or stewardship is more concrete. Ownership refers to the physical control of data. So possession is the mechanism by which ownership can be asserted and protected. So then why does OCAP, you may be asking, matter for artificial intelligence and regulation? Well, AI systems thrive or fail based on trust and consent and accountability. So OCAP kind of already built in the architecture for that. So community ownership, relational accountability, and self-determined use of data. So OCAP really isn't a barrier to innovation. It is a blueprint for ethical AI. And so while Canada is kind of still debating ADA and what responsible AI should look like, Indigenous nations, including those in the North, are already using it as a functioning model. So the future here isn't waiting in Ottawa. It's been in the Indigenous governance spaces all along. Okay, so as we've kind of identified, and maybe people are, their experience with artificial intelligence is that it is accelerating at a pace that no government, no governing body is fully prepared for. And really Canada, Yukon, where I am right now, is no exception. Canada's main piece of legislation, so the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, ADA, what I referenced earlier, is actually still not enacted. So health, justice, education, finance sectors, they've all published guidance, but the guidance is non-binding. It's more like polite suggestions or guardrails. And crucially, what's happening, especially up here, is we are seeing that Indigenous data governance is not being embedded within AI policy. So OCAP is not even really being considered as an Indigenous data model for governance in artificial intelligence policy. So this means that communities that are most impacted by data extraction, which a lot of researchers will be familiar with that term, the communities are being impacted by things without meaningfully being at the policy table. So the good news is that Canada doesn't have to start from scratch, as I've kind of already identified. Indigenous data sovereignty frameworks already exist. What I've recognized in my experience is that they're tested and they're working and they are deeply aligned with what the world is scrambling to figure out right now. So Canada is talking about responsible AI, but Indigenous peoples in the Yukon are practicing it. So the opportunity isn't necessarily to include Indigenous perspectives in AI policy. It's to recognize that Indigenous governance, like OCAP, can really lead the direction of AI in Canada. So from reaction to prevention, most of the mental health systems that I've ever worked in are built on reaction. So we're typically waiting until someone is in crisis and then we intervene. We all know that that can be very costly, it can be very traumatic, and is often too late. So AI gives us this chance to change the story. So it's not necessarily diagnosing people or replacing judgment, like clinical judgment, but it's going to start noticing these early patterns. So these patterns are the kinds that humans often sense, but don't have the capacity to track at scale. So as an example, a little while ago, I was talking with a colleague and they were telling me about this initiative that was happening at the hospital. So they were trying to build, or they were workshopping, an AI system to detect early signs of patient crisis. So the kind that could help intervene before things started to kind of spiral out of control. So they did what a lot of innovative teams do. So they started forming working groups and they interviewed staff across all the units and they gathered data and they asked every clinician they could find, what are the early indicators that somebody is about to crash? And after hours and hours of conversation, they were hoping that patterns would emerge, but instead they recognized that something else actually kept happening. So from nurses to care aides to support workers, the people working closest to the patients, they kept responding with this version of, I know, I can just feel it. So it wasn't in labs and it wasn't in line graphs. It wasn't always even visible behavior, but it was this felt sense, this gut intuition, this gut knowing built from thousands of micro observations to emotional cues to relational history to knowing the background of people to intuition and experience. So kind of this embodied intelligence or human intelligence. And here's the problem with that is that human intelligence lives in the person and not the system. So if that nurse or if that care aide isn't on shift that day, that early warning system doesn't show up to work. And for me, when I was having this conversation with a colleague, is kind of where the light bulb turned on for me in terms of AI. So the goal isn't to really replace that intuition that all of these people and humans are bringing. It's to learn from it. And so it's to start asking, what are the subtle pattern signals behind that gut feeling? And so artificial intelligence, when done well, can help surface these non-obvious connections that humans sense but can't always articulate, that knowing. And if we can translate those intuitive patterns into collective insights that are guided by ethics and context and culture, then we don't lose the wisdom when that person goes home. And so the opportunity isn't necessarily automating intuition, it's honoring it, it's amplifying it, and it's making it shareable. So it's not stripping away the humanity, it's just honoring that it was valuable in the first place. So in my line of work, kind of bringing it back to the mental health realm of things, and on an individual level, we could be looking at things like these small disrupted sleep patterns or withdrawal or language shifts, reduced movement or social disconnection. And it may not mean much alone, but when AI sees that pattern over time, it can signal that, hey, we need to look at something over here because support might be needed, and that can happen before things potentially escalate. So if we reframe this and look at it from a more community level, AI is going to see these early indicators of rising distress in a specific region. So it gives decision makers like funders or program leads, land-based support, school outreach programs, it gives them a bit of a leeway so that support can happen early and it's not happening after crisis. So it's not about replacing clinicians or knowledge holders or community workers. It's really about giving those specific people insights before the crisis happens so that the support is relational and it's timely and it's humane. So when designed with community and culture and data sovereignty at the center, AI kind of becomes this tool for strengthening wellness in a way that makes sense and is very accessible. Okay. So rebuilding trust in data systems. So after everything we've kind of discussed so far, or I've discussed so far, everything from binaries to kind of extractive data to mistrust in the system, people might be asking, or I hope people are asking, what does a different system actually look like? So through my research and through I Know Me, what we've really been playing with up here is this idea of community-specific wellness indices, mental health or mental wellness indices that are co-designed with the communities, with Indigenous communities, with Northern communities. So it's blending qualitative and relational knowledge with data science to understand wellness in real time on community terms. So there's no existing model that's really being adapted to fit. It's being built within and together. So the governance, the indicators, the protocols, the policies, all of the language is rooted in OCAP and Indigenous data sovereignty. So communities own it, they control it, and they really decide how it's used. Nothing is really ever leaving the community. And so for decades, what I've heard and what I've experienced is that data is actually being taken out of the communities. So we design systems where data stays within the communities and interpreted by them. So trust isn't a feature, it's the foundation of the work that we're doing. And again, it's not about numbers necessarily or data or metrics. It's about strengthening the threads of connection. It's about strengthening the connection and patterns between individuals and families and their service providers. So that support is timely and it's culturally grounded and it's at the community level. And what we're starting to see happen is that when people trust the systems, they actually start using them. And when they use them, it becomes this powerful tool. So again, it's not necessarily predicting harm, but it's strengthening wellness and self-determined change. And it's almost kind of creating this trauma-informed approach of, here's what may happen, here are the different options, what do you want to do? Okay. So when the data looks relational, is kind of where the focus is. So for decades, we've really treated data, from my experience, like it's oil. It's extracted, it's stored, it's profited off of in various different ways. But what's really beautiful and what I've come to understand and reframe my learning or lens is that Indigenous knowledge really offers a different metaphor. And the metaphor is kind of, data is more like water. It's life-giving, and if it flows back to the source and remains in the relationship, that's where it becomes valuable. So when people start to share their stories or their experiences or even their health information, they shouldn't have to be waiting, for weeks or months or years to kind of see the impact of that, if they ever see it at all. Relational data means that the insight and data exists in real time, and it flows in real time, and it's returned into the community quickly and clearly, and in a way that supports their decision making and their well-being. From the people, living in the community, individual, to the community systems level, to the governance level. And what's really cool is that this actually isn't a new concept. Reciprocity is foundational in Indigenous innovation and governance. So if something is shared, it needs to be honored and it needs to give back. And in this case, data is no different. It becomes meaningful through those relationships. So instead of this one-way pipeline that we're used to, where data leaves the community and rarely returns, we actually have kind of co-designed this circle. So the community shares, the data becomes insight returns into a usable and empowering way, and the community grows stronger and self-sustainable. And like I mentioned earlier, it really starts building capacity. So every data set is a story. And the question then becomes, who gets to tell it back? I've done a lot of reflecting about this, and this reconciliation kind of goes beyond land acknowledgements. It's really honoring knowledge. It's ensuring that people see themselves in the work that's being done. They're benefiting from the work that they've been putting in, and that their stories are being shared with them in a way that feels good and makes sense. Okay, and so artificial intelligence and Indigenous systems thinking. So we often talk as if Indigenous knowledge and AI live in these different worlds. So I think I've mentioned that a couple of different times. So one is ancient and cultural, the other is modern and technological. But I kept thinking to myself, what if these aren't opposites? What if they are mirrors to each other? So AI's core strength, as some of us may be familiar with, is pattern recognition. But I started realizing through all of this research that Indigenous oral traditions have recognized, stored, and transmitted patterns for thousands of years. We're talking about weather, we're talking about land, we're talking about kinship and wellness and migration and human behavior and health. And what's happening is that story work is actually one of the oldest forms of data science. So machine learning improves through feedback and iteration. Indigenous knowledge evolves through intergenerational teaching, through observing, through trying and refining and passing on what works. So this is adaptive learning, and it is embedded into culture. So my mind then went to, well, artificial intelligent models need training data, and humans need mentors, and they need elders, and they need knowledge keepers. So both shape how we learn, what we value, and how we interpret the world. So AI in this case isn't necessarily our teacher, but it's our student, it's learning. So if we build AI into the conversation with Indigenous knowledge systems, we don't just make it more ethical, we actually make it wiser, we make it more relational, and we just help it become more impactful. Okay. And so today we began by questioning, where do we start? We start with land, we start with relationships, with responsibility, and we trace a journey from kind of binary thinking, unlearning binary thinking, to more relational systems. We went from the idea of extraction to reciprocity. From fear of artificial intelligence to the possibility of Indigenous-led innovation. So for me, rewriting the story means refusing old binaries, Indigenous or Western, clinical or cultural, human or machine. I think that what I'm learning from different communities up here is that the future of wellness truly is relational. It's what happens when we bring knowledge systems together with respect and with balance and with care. When we start to imagine that community-led AI doesn't sit on the margins, it actually starts to inform how we design health systems, where funding goes, and how we measure what success really means. So where data isn't leaving the communities, but it's actually strengthening them, and where technology is not replacing care, it's helping us care sooner. So if we can teach machines to learn, we can actually start teaching these systems to care. And so the future isn't built by algorithms, it's built by us in relationship and in accountability, in courage, and with the humility to learn the knowledge that knowledge systems have cared for people and land way longer than AI has ever really existed. And that brings us to the end. I went a little bit quicker than I had anticipated, but I wanted to thank everybody for being a part of this conversation. And my hope is that when you leave here today, you're not necessarily leaving with answers, but you're leaving with the courage to ask better questions about how we can learn and how we can lead and how we can care. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Taryn. If anyone has questions, we can take some of those. So you can either type them in the chat or you can raise your hand and I will unmute you. So we'll just let people simmer on that for a minute. Anyone? It's always the best part. Okay, Cam has raised a hand. Let's see if I can figure out how to unmute. Are you able to unmute yourself now, Cam?
Yes.
Awesome, success.
Okay. So not exactly a question, but I think I just said that I'm a researcher at UBC, and I'm working on providing a culturally safe care. So, and I'm working also on Indigenous health as well. So what you said to me is really, I mean, it's a beautiful when you put it together, because I think as someone who worked on developing digital solutions, I know that these two can be very silo, and I struggle so much how to reconcile them as someone who wants to follow the OPEC principle, but at the same time want to make data sharing and open and maximize the impact. But so I just to say that it's really beautiful work that you delivered today. I think I'm curious to know about, like, I know that you are the founder of ME, so I think you can just say more a bit about your work and how, I know we don't have a solution here, but how did you start to find the solutions? Maybe that's the question.
Yeah. So I kind of operate, again, I think what I really kind of illustrated here is that there's so many different silos. So a lot of the work that I do with communities is actually very different from community to community. And I think when my ideas kind of first started brewing a couple years ago, I was really thinking about AI from the perspective of a product. So, you know, is there a certain app that, you know, somebody could input their data in so we could get a better sense of, you know, if you're having disrupted sleep, is that an indicator of depression for you? And so that's kind of where my mind was. But what was happening working in mental wellness and substance use was that asking people to use technology that they're not already using is a huge onus on them. You know, you're taking somebody who maybe is experiencing chaos or crisis in their life, and you're saying, oh, and by the way, can you sign up for this app on your phone and track every morning you wake up and track when you eat lunch and tell me when you have a fight with someone, you know? And as great as that would be, it's really difficult to get humans to kind of adapt to any of that stuff. So what I changed my perspective to be like, okay, well, how are people already using AI, and how are people using technology, and what kind of data is already out there that they're not thinking about using? It's kind of passively being collected. And that looks different, and the data is very sparse. And so I started thinking, okay, well, how does that intersect with AI, and how does that intersect with machine learning and algorithms, and how are algorithms built? And so what started happening was I started taking these computational science concepts and using algorithms that are specifically designed for sparse data, and then using the data that's already being accessed and collected. So for one example, and it wasn't exactly this, but just to kind of illustrate, and I think I shared this with Haley in our very first conversation, is there something that being told to us by how many times a person crosses a specific street to get to the community center? So the houses are on one side of the street, the community center is on the other side of the street, and there's a crosswalk. So nobody would think, oh, I'm going to keep pressing the crosswalk button. They just press it to get to the other side of the street. And then I thought, okay, well, there's data there. And can that data tell us a story? Well, that data alone, you know, the electrical usage to cross the street isn't going to tell us anything. However, if we layer that with, okay, well, what was happening in the community that week? Or what is the weather like? Or, you know, what are the conversations that are happening on Facebook? Then it starts to tell a greater narrative. It starts to give context to maybe why that's happening. So with I Know Me, what we're really trying to do is we're looking at these non-obvious indicators, these non-obvious data sets to be like, what story are all of these layers of data telling us, as opposed to just these individual linear, you know, you visited your counselor 3 times this month, last month you did it 10 times, so something's obviously wrong. We know that that's not the case. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of the lens that we're looking from.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a very unique work that you are doing. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Unmute myself. Heather has also asked in the chat. She says, this was so inspiring. As we navigate this relatively new environment of opportunities within AI, I'm keen to understand how these learnings can be integrated and shared across our health environments. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah. I really appreciate that question. Actually, when I was kind of in the midst of designing this workshop, I kept thinking, you know, I'm really approaching things from a mental health perspective. I'm a mental health clinician. I've kind of always lived and breathed in that space. But the concept of data layering and kind of neural data sets being layered in algorithms is actually not new, and it crosses all sectors in technology. So the stories, this is such an I love this question because it's so important. That same example of taking data of somebody crossing the street, you know, if you talk to a mental health clinician in the community, they might say, okay, there's been a huge, you know, surge in depression, and this is what's happening in this office. Whereas if you talk to the highway and public works department, they might say, oh, actually, we had a whole bunch of pylons there because we were doing some work on the concrete. So naturally, people wouldn't be there. So no matter what that data set is or where it originates from, you have to bring it to the source. You have to bring it to the community. You have to bring it to the people to say, this is what we see. Why does this matter? Does this metric matter? Does this data tell a story? And the beautiful thing about it is when you go into the room with, you know, the governance people, or you go into the policy room, or you go into the mental health room, everyone has a story about those specific data lines. And so when we think about, you know, across our different health environments, I think we can kind of use that same approach, is that all data is good data. It just matters who you're talking to about it and how they're understanding it. And that really helps you to understand the importance or the puzzle piece that fills in whatever field you're in, if that makes sense.
Awesome. We had another question here. Anna wants to know, how do you see the role of a human cognitive voice operating an AI app that people use when stressed or in crisis?
Okay.
A tricky one.
Human cognitive voice operating. I think I'm understanding. So when someone is in stress or in crisis, kind of virtually talking to a therabot that talks back. So instead of text writing what's happening in the crisis, I'm thinking somebody actually responding. So there's actually some really interesting work, probably, as you might be aware, that is being done about this. And for me, I don't know if people are familiar with using their iPhones, you know, Siri, for example. You can actually change Siri's voice to, you know, somebody who has a specific accent or, you know, a different gender or something like that. I think it's hugely important. I don't think it's something that can ever be overlooked. I think that as human cognitive voice operating as an app kind of starts coming out and we start seeing more of it, the data is going to tell us a different story, and it is going to impact people in a different way. So while I don't necessarily know the role of it, I do know that I think it already does have a role, and I think the role is very, very important. And my mind is kind of going into a million different directions right now because I start to think of, you know, the voices that it's potentially based on now. And we know that tone and structure of sentences and expressions and mouth movements are different across cultures and different across communities. So I think that's going to be a whole other area of research and probably, hopefully, somebody's thesis question.
Awesome. And one more question. Well, a few more questions actually. Norman is asking, what are practical ways for non-Indigenous analysts to co-create data systems or dashboards that uphold Indigenous sovereignty while remaining operationally useful during emergencies?
Yeah, so practical ways. So my mind kind of goes to all of the instances of co-creating and co-design. And what I really, I think, again, Haley and I had this conversation a little while ago, and we were circling around this idea of, like, you know, what's a piece of advice? Or well, that wasn't the question, but it was something around there. And I said to her, I was like, you know what, showing up authentically, showing up who you are, is the most consistent thing that you can do. I think what happens, at least what I've experienced up here in the communities, is when I first started working in them, I was quiet and I was shy and I didn't want to say the wrong thing and I didn't want to overstep and I was afraid to listen, especially like in policy development and governance, listen to the stories that people were sharing, interpret them, put them into a certain structure and give it back. I was so worried of that giving it back piece to say, you know, this is what I heard, this is how I put it together. What do you think? And much to my surprise, I was welcomed really openly, and it was really warm, and it was very open conversation, and it was very building stuff as we go. So again, back to when I was co-designing kind of policy, or co-designing, tech platforms and stuff like that. It's actually sitting there and just openly having those conversations, reading the room, starting to learn that relational piece of like, okay, I know that this person, doesn't talk a lot, so I'm going to specifically ask them questions. Or if that makes them uncomfortable in, talking in front of people, I'm going to make sure that I go to them after the meeting and have a one-on-one, because they're going to give me more information that way because they're more comfortable there. So really, it's kind of learning the people that you're working with. And so the practical ways of that, I think is just really learning people and building up that relationship.
Awesome. Yeah. I'm pulling up one more question here. Carolyn says, thank you, Taryn, for this timely and important topic and talking about the importance of bringing different health contexts together to use data. I have a practical question. How are decisions about data storage, algorithm design, and interpretation being made? And who in the community holds the authority to approve, pause, or redirect those decisions in alignment with OCAP or Métis OCAS principles?
Okay.
Such as, how does the technical infrastructure align with Indigenous data sovereignty?
Ooh, I love this question. And I love kind of the complexity that I'm going to answer with. It's honestly a community decision. And when I say that, it doesn't mean going door to door and being like, are you okay with this algorithm? Are you okay with this platform? Do you like this color for the logo? It's not that. However, in the First Nation communities that I'm in and that I'm working within and alongside, all decisions are connected. All departments are relational. And so part of my job that I do is when I'm speaking to family council, I'm presenting the information to them in a way that is relevant to the decisions that they're being made from the lens, from their perspective that, they work with all day, and that's going to look very different when I go and brief, the managerial board. They're going to want to see it from a more briefing perspective, more governance, more policy driven. And that's going to look very different from, executive council. Talking to them is more, how does this impact all of the departments? So in an example like IT, are, the users and the support workers okay using this type of cell phone? Is it accessible? Is it easy? Does it feel comfortable? Is it user friendly? And then, when you're speaking to the management board, it's, these are the phones we have. This is the plan we're on. So it's really kind of translating knowledge across all departments to make decisions together.
Awesome. If there's no more questions, I have one. You speak a lot about, the importance of relations and that being very, very central to your work. And I'm curious how you navigate those relations when there might be tension, maybe from somebody who's not eager to adopt something that you're introducing, or we're all aware of there's lots of people around that are much more skeptical of technology, and so I'm curious how you center that relational work while being in conversation with folks that may have a bit more resistance to the initiatives that you're working on.
Yeah. Also really love this. I think speaking from a personal perspective, being a clinically trained therapist, I think I had a little bit more of a structure or framework or lens to approach what we would call conflict resolution. And there is no shortage of conflict in every aspect, every nook and cranny of everything that we're doing, from Facebook posts to words and documents to timing, time of day when things are happening. And what I've really come to understand is when you're moving through that, or the way to kind of work through it, is to sit together. It's to witness and to hear and to understand where people are coming from. So it's not about being right or wrong. It's hearing what someone is saying, but hearing what's not being said and being able to make that information accessible and doing that in a way that is building trust. So that when people are coming to you in confidence with things, you are not, going into the next room and saying, well, so-and-so said this. It's taking the meaning behind what they're saying, whether it's risks or concerns or crisis mitigation or whatever it may be, and making it accessible for the people that you're talking to. And a large part of my work in doing, mental health and innovation and artificial intelligence and all of data sovereignty and all of that, a lot of it has been capacity building. So helping people to have difficult conversations. So the exact work that we were doing in the therapy office is happening in real time, and just making it a really safe place to be yourself.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for that, Taryn. We've still got quite a few questions coming in, if you're okay taking a few more.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Genevieve says, hello, Taryn. Thank you for your presentation. Could you speak a bit more on about how you engage communities and maybe compensate or acknowledge them for their time and contribution?
Yeah. So that looks so vastly different depending on who, what, where, when, why, what community, what it's for. Lots of the different working groups that I am a part of are compensated through their own governance structures. So the First Nations have structures where people are on common roles, like we would call like advisory type roles. And then we're kind of brought in to kind of facilitate those things happening. Other times it is from person to person, like if we're doing a working group or we want somebody to do a survey, I want to say like gift cards, like small things, just like tokens of appreciation. Those always really kind of go a long way. But where my mind is going now is like one of the most beautiful things about being out in community is the power of food. Where there's food, there's people. And so we always have these huge, elaborate, beautiful meals, and the conversations start flying and the people, feel safe and they can access the information. And it's always centered around thankfulness and reciprocity to the land and food and acknowledgement of elders. And it's almost kind of like these aren't even really working groups. It's kind of like their community celebrations of moving, the torch forward. It's really beautiful. So, yeah.
Awesome. That sounds like a really, really positive and fulfilling experience to be able to have.
Mm-hmm.
Dallas has one more question here. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, Taryn. I'm curious, given that climate change has known detrimental effects on both mental and physical well-being, and knowing that AI technology as it operates today has quite a sizable environmental impact, how do you see future policy balancing AI use to support Indigenous community well-being with mitigating its environmental impacts?
Oh my goodness, that is such a hot topic right now. That is at the forefront of not necessarily areas or lanes that I'm kind of working in, but it's definitely kind of this overarching umbrella. It always comes up in the conversation. There's actually a local First Nations man who's conducting some research on data storage and artificial intelligence, like the actual storage in communities. And right now, the costs are exuberant. They're huge, and the impact on the environment is also huge. And so these impact environment assessments are being taken really seriously. One of the jokes kind of ongoing up here is that because it's so cold and it's dark a lot of the time in the winter, it's actually the best place for servers to be because we don't have to pay for air conditioning, which is a bonus, it's a plus. So there's conversations about these big actual physical storage units being up in the Arctic because it's cold, so it keeps the computers cold. So I think those conversations are really just beginning, and they're really, really important, and they're entering into all the work that we do. And I know, actually, for those of you that are familiar with politics in the Yukon, we just have a new territorial government that's been elected, and one of their big focuses is environment. So it's definitely the start of something really big.
Awesome. And Natalie is asking, how do the communities that you work with make informed decisions about AI or data policy with an average basic level of understanding about what AI is and how it works?
Oh, this is my favorite. I obviously love to talk. And so when I think about kind of this, yeah, basic level understanding, so people who aren't speaking in computational scientist terms, they're not talking about algorithms or machine learning. Really, it's coming together and it's asking, you know, what does this mean to you? And that's so revealing. So when we say, okay, you know, we're implementing technology, if you were to go into a room, you know, and say to the working group, we're implementing technology, somebody might be like, okay, does that mean we're getting new cell phones? And then someone else might be like, oh, are we getting a new documentation storage system? Or are we getting archive programs for the photographs upstairs? Or like, you know, how are we doing voice to text from all these cassettes from 30 years ago? Like stuff like that. So making informed decisions about that is really getting a really solid understanding about what the person or that group's priorities are. And then going from there. So if their priority is archives and they're looking at voice to text system from cassettes, then we talk about, okay, what this means is we're then having to use this program. First off, what are our thoughts about that? And really, it's kind of the user experience piece before leading up to even creating policy or making decisions. It's getting comfortable with the conversation first, and then we follow, or I follow their lead. So I don't go in with an agenda of we need to make a decision on this, although, you know, that takes a lot for me because I always want to just move quickly and do all the things. But what I've realized in that relational approach is that people have to trust it, and to trust it, you need to spend time with it, and you need to pick it apart, and you need to sleep on it, and you need to eat, and you need to talk to people, and those you have to have questions and come forward and have answers. So really, making informed decisions about data is figuring out where they see the risks are, addressing those, and then keeping the conversation going and making sure that they always have access to someone who can talk to them about whatever the concerns may be. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Taryn. I think this brings us to our time. We really appreciated hearing your insight. It's a really unique conversation and very insightful. I think what you said about data as water compared to data as oil was really impactful for me and will definitely kind of impact my work moving forward. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And again, the recording will be shared in the digital health learning corner, and then I will send more information to everyone's email as well. So thank you so much for coming, everyone, and thank you, Taryn, for the conversation today.
Yes.
Thank you, Taryn. Thank you, Haley. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.